Well, hello again, everybody. This is John Norris at Trading Perspectives. As always, we have our good friend Sam Clement. Sam, say hello.
Hey, John. How are you doing?
Sam, I'm doing fantastically here today. It's a beautiful day here in central Alabama. However, I'm afraid that some people up in Michigan aren't quite as happy today after Ford's announcement that it's going to postpone construction of its $3.5 billion electronic vehicle battery.
Yeah, I mean, between that and the UAW strike going on, that's really at least somewhat centered around electric vehicles and what that role would play. I think there's probably a lot of people who would say they're not super happy right now up in Michigan.
And certainly the politicians and everyone in Detroit and Michigan that work so hard in order to get this deal done. And Sam, when you really take a look at it, what is the big deal? I mean, why is Ford pausing its construction of this manufacturing facility? After all, doesn't the United States want more electronic vehicles as opposed to fewer?
Well, the easy answer would be, I guess so, or yes, but the problem is, and I think part of why Ford is pausing it, is around kind of a lack of clarity of what really the U.S.'s game plan is with this. You know, legislation about, companies owned by a foreign entity or what have you. And companies in general don't like to make big decisions when there's not a lot of clarity, and there's really not a lot of clarity right now around electric vehicles and the domination by China.
Well, I think on the table is something like a $7,500 tax credit for U.S. consumers which purchase electronic vehicles. However, there are going to be some stipulations in there. I think moving to 2025, if not prior to that, in order to qualify for that tax credit, you have to buy a vehicle that doesn't use a battery that was made within the People's Republic of China, and certainly by the end of 2025. I think the stipulations are you don't qualify if you buy a car that has any component parts actually made in the People's Republic of China. And Sam, that takes us down to a whopping number of zero cars in the globe in around the world that don't use Chinese-made components.
A foreign entity of concern, I think, was the
foreign entity of concern.
The loose, word for China, essentially.
And actually, from what I've read in the stories I've read, Wall Street Journal, elsewhere, seems as though Ford is pausing the construction of this plant more due to political pressure as much as uncertainty about what the administration's EV policies are. After all, certain members of the GOP and even Senator Joe Manchin is pushing back on Ford's plans actually to go in cahoots or go into a licensing agreement with China's largest electronic vehicle battery maker, something called Contemporary Amperex Technology Company Limited, also known as CATL or CATL.
Yeah. And you're even seeing politicians from the state of Michigan pushing back on this. So really, I don't know what people want out of this, because they are, like you said, they dominate. Is probably putting it lightly for what China does in regards to EVs and EV batteries. Dominate would imply like a little bit of competition to dominate.
I mean, to kind of tell you where the U.S. stands relative to the People's Republic in electronic vehicle production or electronic vehicles batteries, EV batteries. It's almost like comparing me to Usain Bolt. That's about how far ahead the PRC is in making batteries. This company, which a lot of people never heard of, CATL or CATL, whichever one you like the best, manufactures over 35% of the world's EV batteries. The next largest producer is another Chinese firm, BYD, which produces over 15%. Actually, out of the world's 10 largest producers, none of them are domiciled or reside or otherwise American companies.
Yeah, it's essentially Chinese and a couple Korean firms and I believe one Japanese firm, Panasonic.
And if what I'm reading is accurate, it seems as though the Chinese construct over 70% of the world's current EV battery supply. And you could argue, hey, if Ford does this with CATL or CATL, then all of a sudden the U.S. would be making it. But are we really, if we're just licensing Chinese technology, understanding that all the parts that we're going to get in order to make these batteries will also largely be coming from the PRC, so it'll be less of a manufacturing facility, more of an assembly plant.
Yeah, and it begs the question and I get some people would say, the climate emergency, but this 911 to get to electric vehicles as quickly as possible, Where kind of on the flip side, we've talked about semiconductors and trying to get semiconductor manufacturing back onshore to, be able to take care of things ourselves, create things ourselves, and not be so reliant on the PRC. When with electric vehicles, it's going kind of the opposite way. To gain an advantage, to actually be able to start producing things, you have to start working with Chinese companies, leveraging them, and really, relying on them.
Oh, you'd have to rely on them. They have the technology. They are easily the world's leading experts on this technology, and let alone the component parts. Sam, I get a wonderful article in the Wall Street Journal here today, which you and I have read, by Andrew Duran, talking about just the sheer dominance that the Chinese have over EV battery production. And in terms of the amount of graphite, which you need the following things to build an EV battery: graphite, nickel, lithium, manganese, and cobalt. Turns as though the Chinese mine about 2/3 of the world's graphite. Nickel is about 20%, lithium between 15 and 20%, manganese around 10%, cobalt not terribly much of anything. Cobalt largely comes from, I think,
Central Africa.
Central Africa does a lot of it. So they are, in terms of raw materials sourcing, they still are kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the room, particularly with graphite. But what's more concerning with that is those are just the raw inputs. You have chemical refining and production. Apparently, the Chinese refine all of the spherical graphite in the world, or 95% of it, or produce it. Manganese refining, over 90% of it. Cobalt refining, 75% of it. Synthetic graphite, something like 2/3. Nickel sulfate, 2/3. Lithium, chemical lithium, just short of 50%. In terms of anode and cathode production, anodes, around 85 to 90%, cathodes over 75%, battery cell production, as we've already mentioned, over 70%. So Sam, how in the world, and by 2025, and Sam, that's 2 years, how in the world is anyone going to qualify for that $7,500 tax credit if they buy a car, if they buy an electronic vehicle car, understanding that virtually all of the inputs have to come from the PRC, either directly or indirectly?
Yeah, you can't, and it all goes down to how strictly they want to enforce this, and does it end up going down to the individual companies, or?
And I think that's what Ford was saying.
Yeah, does it go down to the people and the individual companies, what have you? But again, we have two separate things we really want to happen that, as of right now, with those numbers you said, with the graphite, manganese, all this, we can't become less reliant on China and become more reliant on electric vehicles.
Yeah.
Those two things, it's impossible.
Mutually exclusive, perhaps?
Right now it is.
Yeah.
Right now those two things are mutually exclusive.
Well, because I don't think we're all of a sudden going to start mining a whole bunch of graphite here in the United States.
I don't think so. And GM made an investment in a firm to hopefully mine some lithium. But again, part of it's the timeline. If we said by
2040,
or 2100 or something, we want to be able to produce our own batteries and become less reliant on it. Until then, we're going to do a hybrid plug-in with gas vehicles and focus on that and really dominate that market. That I could get on board with that.
Well, that kind of begs the question. Understanding we are so far behind the Chinese in terms of just EV battery production and just the component parts in order to make an EV. Why are we struggling or putting ourselves in the position where we're trying to hopelessly catch up to the Chinese, all the same while not using Chinese component parts, when there are other things we could be doing, like hybrid vehicles or even flex fuels?
Yeah. I don't get it, and I don't get a lot of things related to this, and understand I don't get, the Chinese can dominate almost whatever market they really want to.
Yes.
There's not a capitalistic focus on what they want to do. I mean, we've seen it with the real estate markets over there, essentially building things just to build them and tearing them down for all intents and purposes. So, but they're not an environmentally focused country.
No.
They're opening more and more coal mines. They are pumping out dirty fuel. yet they're leveraging this. So I don't fully understand that. Besides maybe becoming the dominant player in something that may become profitable down the road. You're right. I don't get what our goal is with this. What's more important to us? Becoming less reliant on the Chinese, or electric vehicles saving the environment in 2 years.
And I guess if you're listening to this and you haven't followed this subject at all, you have to understand the big three, what's known as the big three, U.S. auto manufacturers, make up an increasingly small share of the overall U.S. market, and they aren't even anywhere close to being players in the EV space. Matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, out of the world's top 15 largest EV manufacturers, the big threes, there's not in any of them.
Yeah.
They are so far behind that it's impossible for them to catch. Think of running a marathon and someone being 5 miles behind, maybe 10 miles behind. That's how far North American auto industry is to the Chinese in terms
Outside
of EV
of Tesla,
production.
of course.
Outside of
Not
Tesla,
being a
of
big
course.
three.
Yeah, but that's how far the big three is
Yeah,
behind. So it's very curious why we're doing everything we can to push this, understanding the timelines are so very short. And Sam, I'm going to ask you, as someone of your generation, understanding that, hey, no one wants to see the rivers burn, no one wants to breathe filthy air. Is this realistic, and how does your generation feel about economically, arguably disastrous policies in order to get to sort of environmental utopia where everyone's driving clean cars and not befouling the air, even if that means being beholden to your largest enemy?
Look, I'm probably not the best person to ask about for my generation.
Courtney's no longer here, so
Yeah.
we're not going to call you cynical.
I think you have different groups of people. The people who are most concerned about the environment being their focus on electric vehicles. That's what's clearly pushing the by 2025 type discussion. We need 2030. We need to be all electric vehicles. That group seems to not grasp the dominance that the Chinese have on this right now, and they may say they want to be less, dependent on China, but like we said, that's impossible as of right now. And then you have the group of people who I think just like electric vehicles. If you've driven one, they are really cool to
they're real
drive.
cool. Yeah.
They're really fast, tons of power, torque, all this stuff.
Listen, I get why people like them.
Yeah. If you've ever been in a Tesla Plaid and put the pedal to the floor,
It's like being on a spaceship.
truly, it's awesome. So I'm not against electric vehicles. If I had unlimited money, I'd probably get one that goes really fast and drive it around every now and then. But it's the people focused, I think, more so on the environment being the number one concern, are so focused, hyper-focused on that they're not understanding the unfortunate reality of the situation.
Well, let alone the fact that I think the average EV in the country costs around $65,000, if I'm not mistaken. Even entry-level ones are pretty pricey stuff. So they're kind of out of the market for sort of that third quartile and fourth quartile sort of income earner, even with a $7,500 tax credit. It still doesn't make a lot of economic sense for them. So we're not going to see people down there on that, a good chunk of the U.S. population, even in the market for one, despite a tax credit. And so you kind of take a look at everything going, you kind of have to wonder whether or not the people in Washington proposing this fully understood the true scope of the EV market around the world, particularly batteries and how they produce batteries, and then whether or not they fully understand household finances in the United States. And increasingly, I'm of the opinion that while this sounds like a great thing and kind of idealistic, I don't think it's really based in reality, and certainly someone here didn't seem to do all of their homework in my estimation alone. Not necessarily anyone else's here at Oakhorse. In my estimation alone, it sounds like kind of like, I wish I could have a hamburger, but I don't want you to kill the cow.
Yeah, I think it goes back to even not even just focusing on EVs, this kind of identity politics narrative of idealistic, this sounds great, but you don't really get into the actual weeds of it. And you're exactly right. Eating a hamburger and not wanting to kill the cow. They tried that with all the fake meat, and that hasn't gone so well. But
Well, I mean, even the fake meat
Pretty nasty
isn't
stuff.
necessarily environmentally friendly. You have to put up a lot of palm trees and a lot of in order to get all that
Pesticides
coconut oil, and that kills rainforest and all that. In any event, that's almost an aside. Still, Sam, when I read about this, and frankly, when I see the UAW go on strike, and when I see all these mandates that are out there, I kind of get concerned about the longevity or the long-term health of the big three here in the United States. And while I drive a German car, the big three still are economically important to the U.S. economy. And when I see people, hey, the UAW, let's 32-hour work week, and let's get a 28 to 40% pay increase, and oh, by the way, everything's pushing to EV, although the big three's not set up to do anything about it. What is at stake here for the big three? And with all these conflicting messages, well, not even conflicting messages, all of these things that Washington and politicians and everyone wants the big three to do, how can they possibly do it all, or even a fraction of it, in the short timeline with which they have to do it?
Well, they can't. That's kind of the simple answer. There's no way. The big three fully transitioned to being able to produce their own electric batteries and being able to dominate the car market in the timeline that we want it. The only way, if your number one goal is to get everyone on an electric vehicle by 2030, it is going to be massively reliant on the Chinese market.
Yes.
Through either Chinese brand cars, which is probably the less likely part of it, but you never know. And more so, it's the battery side of it. The batteries will be dominated by the Chinese market.
And I don't see any reason why that's going to change, even if Ford does put up a battery production facility here in the United States. The Chinese have such a head start. I don't see how they don't continue to dominate. And speaking in terms of Chinese brand EVs, if I'm not mistaken, they're starting to dominate the European market as well. And you have a lot of European countries where are really going all headfirst into EVs. And if I'm not mistaken, there's some German automobile manufacturers saying that if their trade representatives don't get a handle on something like that, there's not going to be a European EV market, because the Chinese are just producing them so cheaply. Believe it or not, they're actually pretty well made, and they can just come on in there and undercut the competition with a reasonably made vehicle. And frankly, why wouldn't they be reasonably made? They're already the technology experts in the industry, and right now I think it's something like Chinese firms control, if I'm not mistaken, 15-20% of the European EV market, or some crazy number in a very short period of time.
And that market is ripe for electric vehicles, if that's the route we want to go. The trend of smaller cars there, smaller roads.
I guess it's just more densely packed. You don't drive quite as far.
No, you don't drive as far. There is not this relying on, 3-row SUVs and pickup trucks that we have here, and that is the right market for it. And like you said, I mean, they're already kind of capitalizing on it.
So what does the future hold? Well, by the time all the dust settles and the smoke clears and all of that, what does the EV market look like here in the United States by your estimation, understanding that we're going to have to get some economic common sense up in Washington from everyone involved, understanding these timelines are just not realistic, and it's also not realistic to say you can't involve the Chinese in this, but what does that mean moving forward? Maybe not 2 years from now, we need to get a cold dose of reality, a cold glass of water to the face. Maybe not 2 years from now, 2025, like the administration has proposed, but let's say 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, 20 years down the road. Is that a little bit more realistic expectation if EVs are truly what we need to do, as opposed to something like more flex fuel and more hybrid cars, where we already have a very strong comparative advantage, and we don't have to build out all the infrastructure around the country in order to get there.
Obviously, something's going to have to change from this. Get everything on EV and not be relying on China. Something's going to change. Whether it's loosen up the language around what a foreign entity of concern is, whether it's focusing on maybe a little more on hybrids, and this 2030 gets bumped back to 2040, 2050, what have you. Something is going to have to change with this current goal of not being reliant on China and being fully electric by 2030. What it looks like in the future, I mean, not talking about the stock itself, but it's hard to imagine this not being good for Tesla, the company
Yeah.
that's already kind of dominating
Yeah.
the,
US market, yeah.
the global and especially the U.S.
Yeah.
market. That's just I'm not using some great analytics to get to that. I mean, just the company's already
The numbers
doing,
are what the numbers are.
yeah, the company's doing really well, and
And
with
even
the
you can even drive around Birmingham, Alabama, and you see
they're everywhere.
You see a fair
yeah,
number
they're
of Teslas,
already
yeah.
everywhere. So, you know, I do. Obviously, I think that's an easy answer. That something's going to have to change.
Now, what do you think this means for the used car market moving forward if we do all this EV stuff? The government certainly can't force us to get rid of our old cars. And don't you think that could lead to, hey, you might want to hold on to that clunker for a little while longer because there's going to be a huge demand for it. moving
Yeah, I
forward.
mean, I think you've already seen it. And again, this isn't going with full EV, but there's been some truck lines that have stopped making their big, 5-6 liter V8 engine and have just shifted down to some
You
smaller.
probably should have anyhow. I mean, it's just, you get past some of those guys,
I don't
big,
know. It's
big
pretty
diesel
awesome.
engine.
It's pretty awesome. Yeah. But, those trucks have already kind of held their value more because people may say, oh, I could get the new one with a 2-3 liter twin turbo engine, but I want the famous V8 engine that they always made.
You want the power.
Yeah. And
That's part of the reason why you would buy a big truck like that, right? I mean, I'm not a truck person. I drive around my little sedan.
you,
and all
you
that
just
stuff.
you just said German, so I think people are thinking
Yeah,
your
drive
Porsche.
around. No, not quite. Although they're made in the same factory, they're just not quite the same thing. That's part of the reason why you buy that type of car, right?
Yeah, I
I
think
mean, the power behind it.
Yeah, and sitting up real high
Yeah,
and-
I mean, that's the reason why you buy it.
Sure.
So we're not only talking about environment, we're talking about trying to force consumer patterns.
They're
I
even
mean,
pumping sound into the new ones that don't have the sound of a V8
What do you mean?
to make it sound in the inside like it does when you have an actual V8 engine.
What's so funny is 150 years from now, we'll have these cars that make these sounds, and people are going to go, why do we have this
Yeah.
sound being pumped into
Yeah.
this? That
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense. And people go, well, that's how they liked it back then. Well, I don't like it now.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of funny how things happen like that. Well, Sam, I'm not sure if we traded perspectives on anything here today or maybe even accomplished terribly much, but when we take a look at headlines out there, you see everything that's going on with the Big Three with the UAW. You read headlines about Ford, pausing production on an EV battery plant. You read about the administration's plans to put out tax credits, and in order to qualify for them, you have to buy an EV car that doesn't have any Chinese-made components, and that's a little bit of hyperbole, but not much. It just really kind of begs the question, Sam, do we know what we're doing?
Well, I think we've already answered that. The resounding no.
So with that, we always do have to caution folks. Anything that we say here at Trading Perspectives is pretty much Sam's opinion, my opinion, and not necessarily those of Oakworth Capital Bank or any of its other associates or shareholders, directors, all that good stuff. Also, we always love to hear from you. Also, if you have any comments or questions, please, by all means, let us know. You can always drop us a line at tradingperspectives@oakworth.com, or you can leave us a review on the podcast outlet of your choice. Of course, if you're interested in reading more or hearing more of what we have to say or what we think, you can always go to our website, oakworth.com, OAKWORTH.com. Take a look underneath the Thought Leadership tab and find all kind of exciting information, including links to previous podcasts, links to our blog or newsletter Common Sense, as well as links to our quarterly economic pieces and our magazine Macro and Market. With that, Sam, we'll give you a last chance to have something weighty to say about this very important topic.
That's all I got.
That's all I've got today, too. Y'all take care.